Imagine that you were transported back to the 1990s and saw the India of that time. What would you think about its prospects? A poor and backward country struggling to feed its people. And now, go back to the present. What would you see? A vibrant and dynamic country that is driving global growth and innovation. How did India achieve this? Can India become the next global superpower? Please look at this diagram. It shows what has happened to India's economy in the last 60 years. It has been stable and growing almost continuously. And here is what has happened to its population in the same time. There are 3 times as many people, almost 1 billion more to be exact. Imagine India, a former British colony that London has controlled and oppressed for centuries. This year, they are overtaking London. This means that India now produces more goods and services than Britain. Right now, only 4 countries are ahead of India: the United States, China, Japan, and Germany. In general, India has a reputation as the most promising economy in the world. But the country is in constant conflict with its neighbor, Pakistan, and for 75 years, has been occupying territories that Pakistan considers its own. It is assumed that today there are 3 likely conflicts over which a nuclear World War III will begin. In first place, of course, is a straightforward mess between the US, Russia, or China. As you can see, it could start in Ukraine, or it could start in Taiwan. The third most likely war is between Israel and Iran. The Israelis presumably have nuclear weapons. Tehran does not, but they want them by all means to bring order to the region. Well, you know how these desires end. And the second place among the probable causes of global nuclear apocalypse is the confrontation between the 2 official nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, although they used to be a single state of British India. Here, notice their flag. It is very similar to what Canada had before '64 and what Australia still has today. For those who don't know, they were one big British empire. It all started with Vasco da Gama. This is the kind of Portuguese navigator who, instead of the lost in America, Columbus, is the first to take the sea route from Europe to India. This is the route Europeans seek in order to trade faster and more across the sea. And at first the Europeans and India themselves get rich from this trade. But the Western guys see that they have stronger weapons. And India is not one strong nation. There are about 400 of these nations. And the British first captured India, and then used the famous principle of divide and conquer. So how did India stop being a colony? When one oppresses another, sooner or later, there will be someone who will stop this injustice. And in India, that man was Mahatma Gandhi. Many of you may have heard of his ideas of nonviolent resistance to evil, and that his fiery speeches would eventually lead to the fall of the British Empire and India's independence. And all this happened in 1942, in Bombay. There, Gandhi called on a huge crowd to defy the colonial authorities and openly proclaim India's future independence from the British Empire. He convinced his compatriots to put aside all prejudices, personal, racial, caste, or national, and invited them to follow his life motto, do or die. Either we will liberate India, or we will die along the way. We will not live to see our slavery continue. Guys, think about it. These are the kinds of leaders that are often lacking in societies that seem to be in a state of slavery. And for the British colonial administration, the Gandhi movement is an incredible problem. Well, of course, the formidable British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in his speeches calls for starving to death in prison, a familiar move. But in the end, Gandhi and his ideology are just as victorious. India becomes independent. But unfortunately, the violence will not end there. In fact, it will only begin when Hindus and Muslims get their long-awaited freedom. They will accept to kill each other even more brutally than the British troops did. And the former colony will break up into India and Pakistan. And one of the main problems is that the border between India and Pakistan will be drawn in just 40 days by a man who has never been to India. He will do it solely on the basis of colonial census data. In addition, most local princes do not want to join India or Pakistan. They would like to gain their own independence. But at the same time, one realizes that there is no other choice. This issue has become particularly acute for the regions of Jammu and Kashmir. The vast majority there are Muslims, about 77%, but the local ruler is already closer to India and does not want to go to Pakistan. He generally proposes to live separately and just make profitable trade agreements, as they say, without obligations. Pakistan thought, here our Muslim brothers are being insulted. They need to be urgently protected. And the Pakistani military invades the rebel principality and wants to take it by force. In response, the local leader asks for protection from India and ends up signing a document to join them rather than Pakistan. That's how it ends. But these territories have been disputed for 75 years, and there is a constant war over them. Look, It's about 60% under Indian control, 40% under Pakistani control. The Chinese, however, have taken a chunk of it under their control. At the same time, both consider the principality entirely theirs, and the lands occupied by the enemy are called occupied. But lest you think that if Pakistan is now purely Islamic, and India has become purely Hindu. No, officially there are 200 million Muslims living in India now. You think this is the population of a huge country. In fact, Pakistan has approximately the same number of Muslims, 212 million. It would seem that they have nothing to divide, as they are so similar. But in this dispute, if you have noticed, there's a third country, China. Look, back in the 60s, Pakistan deliberately ceded part of its territory to the Chinese for military and diplomatic assistance. Well, for example, developing a military strategy to contain India. Why? Because India is China's main opponent in the region. India is clearer and closer to Western civilization because India is the second most English-speaking country in the world. As of 2017, that's 130 million people. Even in the homeland of English Great Britain, there are half as many. It is this educated audience that India is banking on. For example, there is a Fortune 500 list. You have probably heard of it. It includes the 500 largest companies in the world. Well, 5 years ago, 185 of them were using Indian software. So when you have tens or even hundreds of millions of educated native English speakers, you become a key player anyway. It's easy to find markets because almost all of your IT specialists are fluent in the main international language. China, by the way, cannot boast of this. And purely statistically, with a huge population, you will, by all means, have a lot of IT specialists. There are almost 5 million of them in India right now. How come there are so many of them? It all starts right here in the city of Bangalore. Today it is called India's Silicon Valley, because almost all the major local startups are born here. And Google, Apple, Microsoft, IBM, Adobe, and others will open their offices here. Beginning in 1984, American companies opened branches in Bangalore. Can you guess why? To take qualified engineers and take advantage of low development costs. So people would come from all over the country in search of education and jobs. And then in the 2000s, the most promising Indian IT startups would come here. And today, it is one of the 6 world capitals of unicorns. If you do not know, for about 10 years they called unicorns the companies that rushed from zero and are now worth $1 billion or more. So the main city for unicorns is, of course, San Francisco, with New York in second place. Next come Beijing and Shanghai. Fifth place, according to statistics, is London. And at the end of the list is Bangalore. But the fact that 5 million IT people live well in the country is not an indicator for everyone else, because there are more than 1 billion of them. You have probably heard that they are trying to call India today the equivalent of China 30 years ago. Rapid economic growth, a huge population, cheap labor, and those who want to produce something cheaper are also looking toward the ideas of its billion manpower. But the difference between India and China is that they choose different models of development. Beijing, in its time, clearly copied the so-called Asian tigers. South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. That is, first in the 1980s, it attracted a lot of Western money to build endless factories and plants, where former Chinese peasants worked for mere penny. India, despite its huge, cheap labor force, chooses a different path. Not to produce consumer goods for the whole world, but to compete for leadership in fields such as software and pharmaceuticals. They need people with expensive education, and here the English-speaking Indian minority will benefit, while the rest of the population will still live in poverty. India has already overtaken China to become the most populous country in the world, and importantly, the people there are much younger than in all developed and developing countries. Half of those living in India are under 25 years old. Such a young society adapts much easier and better to new technologies and develops them. Imagine how important it is that the country with the largest and youngest human resource not fall into any kind of nationalism or into a big war with its neighbors, be it China or Pakistan, but that it continues its economic growth and pulls everyone else along with it. In conclusion, India is on the verge of becoming the next global superpower. Its large population, growing industries, achievements in space technology, globally recognized companies, and world-renowned universities are all strong indicators of its potential. The country still faces challenges, but with initiatives aimed at promoting economic growth, innovation, and education, India is well positioned for success. The world should keep a close eye on India's progress, as it has the potential to be a major player in shaping the future of our planet.